June 22, 1940. Inside a railway carriage deep in the Compiègne forest, the very same coach where Germany had accepted defeat in 1918, French delegates now sign an armistice with Nazi Germany. After 6 brutal weeks of fighting, France has lost 90,000 soldiers, 60,000 civilians, and nearly 10 million people have fled south in the largest civilian flight Europe has ever seen. And just like that, it's over. France has fallen. But across the English Channel, Winston Churchill declares that Britain will continue the fight. Alone in Paris, now filled with German uniforms and checkpoints, in the villages of Normandy, still scarred by fresh bombardment, in the quieter towns of the unoccupied South, where refugees overflow into every spare room, French citizens hear the news, and their reactions are far from uniform. Their responses reveal something deep about defeat, resilience, and the strange hope that can appear even when a nation collapses. The reactions split in ways no one could have predicted. Simone de Beauvoir, 32, sits in a Paris café now crowded with German officers. She writes in her diary that she feels a guilty sense of relief. The shooting has stopped, and her friends won't die tomorrow. But when she hears that Britain refuses to surrender, she scribbles a sharp line. The English are insane. They'll be invaded in a matter of weeks. What was the point of all this suffering? She isn't alone across Paris and across occupied France. Many feel the same exhaustion. They watched their army collapse in a mere 6 weeks. They saw highways jammed with refugees, Stuka dive bombers screaming overhead, tanks rolling past landmarks they thought eternal. The idea that Britain, with its tiny army and the humiliation at Dunkirk, stripped of equipment, might somehow defeat Germany, to many it sounds absurd. A woman in Lyon, her name long lost, writes her sister in America, "The British fled at Dunkirk and left us to face the Germans. Now they want to keep fighting? Fine. We're done with war." This bitterness is widespread. The British evacuated 338,000 troops, including 123,000 French soldiers, but abandoned their heavy guns, tanks, and gear. To many French civilians, it feels like Britain ran home, only to scold France for surrendering. In Marseille cafés and in the temporary Vichy capital where Pétain is forming his new government, a dark joke circulates. The British will fight to the last Frenchman. But move into different towns, talk to different people, and a very different sentiment emerges. On a beach in Brittany, a fisherman named Jean-Marie Cervella, age 41, too old to serve, stares across the channel toward England. His 2 sons were taken prisoner. He doesn't know if they're alive. When he hears Churchill's promise to fight on, he feels something he hasn't felt in days: hope. If the English don't quit, he tells his wife quietly, then maybe this isn't finished. Maybe our boys will come home. In the unoccupied zone, many don't see British defiance as madness at all. They see courage. A teacher in Toulouse writes, "Pétain tells us to accept defeat with dignity, but the English refuse to accept defeat at all. Which of us is truly dignified?" Class divides shape the reactions. The bourgeoisie, property owners, traditional families, embrace Pétain's armistice. It promises stability, a return to order, familiar values. But working-class citizens, leftists, and those already skeptical of the elite see Britain's refusal to surrender as a spark of resistance. A factory worker in Saint-Étienne tells his co-workers, "The wealthy made peace with the Germans, but English workers are still fighting. Maybe this war isn't finished." In the occupied north, German soldiers prowl the streets. Supporting Britain openly could be fatal. People whisper their thoughts behind closed doors. Families tune in to the BBC's French broadcasts with curtains drawn and the radio turned low. Some feel a tiny ember of hope. Others think the British broadcasts are wishful fantasies. In the Vichy-controlled South, speech is freer. But the government line is relentless. Britain abandoned France. Britain caused France's misery. Britain will fall next. A shopkeeper in Vichy writes to his brother, "Pétain has saved France from ruin. The English are reckless. When they're invaded, they'll regret not making peace like we did." But others notice something strange. A librarian in Clermont-Ferrand tells her husband, "If Britain's defeat is so certain, why do the papers repeat it every day?" Then comes July 3, 1940. The British Royal Navy launches a devastating attack on the French fleet at Mers-el-Kebir. Fearing the ships could fall into German hands, the British issue an ultimatum. The French admiral refuses. The British open fire. 1,297 French sailors are killed. The news erupts across France like a shockwave. In Paris, in Lyon, in Marseille, in villages both free and occupied, the reaction is immediate and furious. Even those who admired Britain's determination feel betrayed. Former allies have become killers. A woman in Bordeaux, whose cousin died in the attack, writes, "I wanted to believe the English would someday liberate us. Now I see they're no better than the Germans. They've murdered our men." And at that moment, Vichy propaganda pounces, ready to exploit the grief. Posters begin appearing overnight. Bold illustrations of British warships unleashing fire on French sailors. Newspapers splash outraged headlines accusing Britain of treachery. Pétain himself condemns the attack as an act of hateful aggression. And for several weeks, public opinion swings sharply. The anger is so intense that even people who despise Vichy struggle to reconcile what Britain has done. A young Parisian, who would later become part of the resistance, writes years later, "Mers-el-Kebir made me despise the English for months. I understood the tactical reasoning, sure, but knowing the logic didn't soften the bitterness." But then something surprising happens. The resentment doesn't last for everyone. As summer fades into autumn and the Battle of Britain erupts in the skies over England, the mood shifts yet again. German bombers cross the Channel day after day. The Luftwaffe is expected to crush Britain in a matter of weeks. Vichy newspapers confidently predict that British surrender is inevitable. German newsreels showcase burning neighborhoods in London, smashed factories, battered docks. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, is said to be imminent. But Britain does not collapse. The RAF fights back. German casualties grow, weeks pass, months pass, and Britain is still holding on, still resisting, still refusing to yield French civilians notice. In occupied Paris, a baker named Henri Dubois listens secretly to the BBC on a concealed radio. He hears claims of RAF victories, German aircraft shot down, British resolve hardening. He isn't sure if these broadcasts are exaggerating, yet he sees German officers around him growing tense. The invasion expected in August, then promised for September, simply never happens. Maybe, he whispers to his wife late at night, maybe the English aren't as doomed as everyone said. Far to the south, a farmer in the Vichy zone watches German newsreels at his local cinema. He sees the flames, the wreckage, but he also sees the British population refusing to break. And Churchill, speaking with ferocious determination, the same man who once believed Britain's decision to fight on was insane, begins to have second thoughts. By the winter of 1940 to 41, French attitudes shift once more, not everywhere. Not universally, but in certain regions and inside certain households, Britain's endurance begins altering the mood. A young woman in Lyon, Lucie Aubrac, who would later become a renowned resistance figure, recalls this moment in her memoirs. When Britain survived the bombings, when they stayed standing after month upon month of attacks, something inside us changed. Resistance no longer felt like fantasy. If they could hold out alone, maybe we didn't have to surrender to despair either. Class divisions remain, though they evolve. The bourgeoisie, who initially backed Vichy, begin quietly reconsidering their loyalties. What if Britain does manage to survive? What if Germany isn't invincible? Better, some think, to be cautious in public conversations, just in case. A businessman in Toulouse who once praised Pétain's wise peace now casually claims he always believed the British would endure. Among workers, especially the left-leaning, Britain's survival fuels a growing belief in resistance. Communist laborers in Paris, despite the still active Nazi-Soviet pact, see Britain's stubbornness as proof that fascism can be fought. Socialist workers in Marseille begin organizing in secret. Britain's example becomes a spark, yet the regional divide deepens sharply. In occupied northern France, German authority is absolute. Even implying support for Britain can be deadly. The Gestapo and Vichy police arrest people merely suspected of listening to the BBC, of spreading Gaullist rumors, of expressing the faintest hope that Britain might win. A woman in Lille is arrested for muttering that she hopes the British triumph. She spends 6 months in prison. In the unoccupied southern zone, conversation is still dangerous, but Possible. Pétain's government officially condemns Britain, but it cannot police every kitchen table families speak in low voices about what Britain's survival might mean. A teacher in Montpellier assigns his class a neutral essay about the war. One 14-year-old writes, "Marshal Pétain tells us we must accept defeat, but the English show that defeat can be refused. I don't know who is right, but I know which idea makes me feel less ashamed." The teacher hides the essay instead of reporting it. He has begun to wonder if the boy has expressed a truth adults are afraid to say aloud. By 1941 and 1942, as Britain not only survives but begins striking back, and as the war widens to include Russia and later the United States, French public opinion continues shifting and reshaping itself. Those who once saw Britain's refusal to surrender as stubborn foolishness now view it as strategic foresight. Those who once accused Britain of abandoning France now quietly hope that the British will one day liberate them. Those who once embraced Vichy's collaboration start distancing themselves when German victory feels less certain. But none of it is simple. A woman in Paris whose brother died at Mers-el-Kebir never forgives Britain, not even after the liberation. A man in Bordeaux who admired Britain in 1940 becomes a collaborator by 1942, convinced Germany will ultimately prevail. A family in Normandy splits down the middle. The father clings to Vichy. The sons join the resistance, inspired by Britain's endurance. The daughter marries a German officer. The vast diversity of French opinion, the contradictions, the reversals, the emotional swings, reveals something deep about defeat, identity, and hope. When France capitulated and Britain chose to stand alone, the French people didn't respond with one voice. They responded as millions of individuals, each carrying their own fears, loyalties, wounds, and dreams. Some saw Britain's stance as noble. Some thought it was reckless. Some believed both at once. Some changed their minds repeatedly. Some never budged at all. A man in Toulouse, captured in the fighting, later released, writes to his sister in 1943, "When we surrendered and the English kept fighting, I thought they were fools. I was sure they'd be invaded by September and we'd all end up under German boots anyway." He ends his letter with a question that haunts him. So what was the point of more dying? But the British were never invaded. They stood their ground. And months later, as he joins the resistance, he writes again, "The English were right. Some things have to be fought for, even when everything seems lost." His sister disagrees. She answers with a letter of her own. "You say the English were right, but how many more French families buried their dead because they kept fighting? How many more towns were flattened? What if everyone had agreed to peace back in 1940? Maybe we'd all be alive. Maybe we'd all still be whole. Maybe the English just stretched out the suffering." Both letters survive in archives. Both viewpoints are authentic. Neither tells the whole story without the other, because the story of how French civilians responded when Britain fought on and France surrendered is not one simple narrative. It is a collection of millions of reactions, shifting over days, then weeks, then years, shaped by class, geography, political loyalty, exhaustion, grief, pride, suspicion, and hope, all swirling together. In occupied northern France, a woman hides a downed British pilot in her attic. She risks her own life to help get him out of the country. Later, she explains why. Because after we stopped fighting, they didn't. Someone had to remember that resisting was still possible. But only a few blocks away in that same city, another woman denounces her neighbor for listening to the BBC. She believes in Pétain's promise of a renewed France in cooperation with Germany. She thinks the British are only dragging the war out unnecessarily. She isn't cruel, she's terrified, and she trusts the authorities who insist collaboration will bring peace. In the southern zone, a village mayor refuses to enforce Vichy's anti-Jewish laws. When asked why, he says, "The English are still resisting. That means none of this is settled. We don't have to obey orders that betray who we are." He saves 17 Jewish families. But in the next village, another mayor enforces those same laws eagerly. To him, Vichy represents France's future. Britain's fight is irrelevant. A foreign problem, not his concern. He sees no connection between British defiance and the moral choices in front of him. By 1944, as Allied forces prepare the invasion, as the resistance grows, and as Vichy's power collapses, public opinion in France has changed dramatically. Most civilians now view British perseverance as the right call. Most now hope desperately for Allied liberation, but that is hindsight. The clarity that only victory brings back in June 1940, when cities lay in ruins, when France toppled in only 6 weeks, when Britain chose to stand alone, no one knew how the story would end. People made judgments with the fragments of information they had, with fear, with fatigue, with anger, with instinct, with whatever scraps of hope or bitterness they still carried. Some saw Britain's refusal to surrender and felt abandoned. Some saw it and felt inspired. Some felt both at the same time. Some changed their minds repeatedly. Some never changed at all. All of them were French. All of them were trying to survive. All of them were trapped inside a moment where the future was completely unknowable. In Provence in 1945, an elderly woman is asked what she thought when Britain decided to fight on while France laid down its arms. She replies, "I thought the English were insane. I thought they'd be wiped out. I thought we'd all be wiped out. But somewhere deep inside me, I also felt that maybe insanity was what the moment demanded." She pauses, then adds, "Maybe surrender was the sensible choice, and hope was the madness, and maybe, just maybe, we needed more madness." She looks at the interviewer. "I was right. We did need that madness. We needed someone to refuse the logic of defeat, even if it was the English, even after Dunkirk, even after Mers-el-Kebir. We needed someone to show us that no was still possible." Then she finishes quietly, "But in 1940, I thought they were simply crazy." That uncertainty, that terrifying sense of living inside history without knowing its ending, was the reality for French civilians in the summer of 1940. They didn't know Britain would survive the Blitz. They didn't know the US would enter the war. They didn't know Germany would be defeated. They only knew France had surrendered and Britain had not, and they had to decide what that meant for themselves. Their answers ranged across the entire human spectrum because they were human, because human beings don't move in straight lines, because fear and courage, despair and defiance, anger and admiration don't sort themselves into neat categories. Some French civilians cheered British determination. Some denounced it. Some changed their views as the war shifted. Some refused to change at all. What they said when Britain continued the fight while France capitulated was everything at once: anger and admiration, despair and hope, betrayal and inspiration, resentment and relief. Millions of voices wrestling with an impossible moment in millions of different ways. And that complexity, that refusal to become a clean, simple story, is exactly why the responses remain so human, so messy, so real, and so worth remembering. They were not characters in a scripted drama with clear heroes and villains. They were ordinary people trying to survive, trying to interpret catastrophe, trying to figure out what to believe when their world had fallen apart. Some understood correctly. Some were completely wrong. Most were somewhere in between, just as we would be today, navigating our own impossible moments, deciding when to surrender and when to fight, when to despair and when to hope, and whether defiance is courage or madness. The French civilians of 1940 didn't know they were living inside history. They were simply trying to live through it. And everything they felt, everything they argued, feared, hoped, doubted, and believed was part of the vast, tangled truth of what it means to watch your world collapse and then choose somehow what must come next.